Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I know all of us, when we have the opportunity to stand up in this House, are very proud for the opportunity to represent our constituents. Now, I've been up in this House many times, but I think this is one of the most proud moments I've ever had as a parliamentarian, as I have the opportunity not only to represent my own constituents, but farmers and ranchers and farm families and processors in this industry across Canada, as I present an amendment to the Health of Animals Act, which I am confident all members of this House will support, as it will protect the mental health of our farm families, but also the integrity of our food supply. And I want to take the members of this House back just over a year ago, and I received a frantic phone call from a farmer in my riding. He was extremely upset as him and his sons got up to check on their turkeys in the morning, and when they walked into their barn, they found dozens of activists and protesters had broken onto their farm, but also into their barns, demanding the release of their birds. What made this interesting is these were free-range turkeys. They were not in cages. They were not mistreated in any way. They were healthy and happy. The only risk to the health of these animals was actually from the protesters who were on that property. When I left from Ottawa and went back home to the riding to meet with Mr. Shetter and his family, he was completely distraught. He hadn't slept in days. He didn't understand why he was targeted. He's done everything he possibly can to take care of his animals because he knows they're his livelihood. In fact, he had nothing to hide. When he got into his barn that morning and saw 30 or 35 protesters, he invited them for a tour of his farm. And he did. He invited the media, he invited the protesters to walk, and the activists to walk and look and see what he had and what his operation entailed. And that is what my bill is going to be trying to address here today, Madam Speaker, is really two things: the mental health of our farmers and our farm families, and the protection of those families and their workers and the animals that they take care of, but also the very important issue of biosecurity on our farms. This is a critical issue as we try and protect our food supply and our supply chain. Now, what my bill entails to do is a very simple change and amendment to the Health of Animals Act. And I really wanted to try and make it as simple as possible, Madam Speaker, that we could get support from every member in this House. The Act, as it currently stands, the Health of Animals Act, it has control of diseases and toxic substances that may affect animals and diseases transferred from animals to humans. However, the obligations and prohibitions within the Act only deal with the farmer who owns those animals. There are no protections in the Act that deal with individuals or organizations who may break into private property and put those animals at risk. And that was really what my amendment and my private member's bill is trying to address. I didn't want to invent something new. I wanted to have something that was specific to the issue that we're dealing with, but also that wasn't a one-off on the issue that happened in my own riding, but something that could address the bigger picture of biosecurity on our farms. And I really want to be crystal clear on this, Madam Speaker, and to all members in this House. The one thing that this bill does not do, it is not a prohibition of protesting. Absolutely. Protesting one's view and one's opinion is your right as a Canadian, and we want to uphold that. Your right to protest on public property is absolutely your right. However, when you are crossing a line and entering or breaking into private property and putting the health of animals and farm families at risk, there has to be consequences. And I think all of us in this House would understand this is not an isolated incident. My staff and myself, we went through media reports and did the research. There have been literally dozens of these types of incidents across this country, touching ridings of every single party in this House, from one coast to the next, in every sector of agriculture. We had 50 protesters at a hog farm in Abbotsford, BC. We had people trying to forcibly remove animals from a dairy farm in Quebec. And certainly we saw protesters at a farm, a pork breeding facility in Ontario. And as I said, Mr. Speaker, this really sparked an interest in me with this incident in my own riding with the Shetter family, and the impact it had not only on that family, but in farm families from across my riding who inundated our office with, like, is this now, are we free game for protesters and activists? Or are we not safe on our own farm? Are our animals not protected? And what really struck me with that protest at that farm in Fort Macleod, which is usually quite a quiet little town, was the fact that many of those activists and those protesters had been on a hog farm in Abbotsford only a week before. And this is really the crux of my private member's bill, Mr. Speaker, is I don't think these protesters quite understand, perhaps for no fault of their own, they don't understand the consequences of their actions or the very strict biosecurity protocols we have on farms. And they are there for very important reasons. I know my colleagues in this House understand that farmers, ranchers, and processors, no one cares for their animals and their land and their environment more than they do. And I hope that's an important aspect of this bill that we can focus on through our debate this evening, which is that biosecurity aspect. Because when those protesters are coming onto private property and breaking into barns in areas that they may not fully comprehend what's at stake, they're posing a very real risk to a critical industry within our country. And this is very real, Mr. Speaker. African swine fever, avian flu, foot and mouth disease, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, are very real threats to our industry. Obviously, this has hurt my riding. Almost 2 decades ago, we had the BSE outbreak in Alberta. That was between a $6 and $10 billion impact on our cattle industry in Canada. As the second that BSE was confirmed in central Alberta, more than 40 countries shut their borders to Canadian cattle exports. $10 billion hit. Most importantly, Mr. Speaker, 3,000 ranches went out of business, including many of my constituents and my friends. I can recall ranchers like Grant Hershey finding a little processor, slaughtering his cattle, finding a reefer truck, a used refrigeration truck, and driving up and down Highway 2 trying to sell his beef on the side of the highway, just to keep his operation afloat. Thousands of ranchers were not so lucky. And almost 20 years later, we are still trying to rebuild our cattle herd in this country. 20 years later, the impact of that outbreak is still being felt today, and many countries are only now reopening their border to Canadian beef. In 2004, we had a massive outbreak of avian flu in the Fraser Valley. Almost 300 million animals had to be euthanized. The economic impact of that was more than $300 million. And we have to be aware of avian flu to this day. Now, there were some positives that came out of that. We have improved surveillance, improved testing, improved quarantine measures, but most importantly, improved regulations and protocols around biosecurity, which everyone must abide by. I know many of us in this House who had an opportunity to tour the farms and ranches in our constituencies or neighbouring constituencies in rural Canada understand when you go visit that farm. I visited the Keelstreet Farm poultry operation this summer. I was putting on booties, I was putting on a lab coat, a hairnet, face mask. This had nothing to do with COVID. This was the biosecurity protocols on just about every farm in Canada that many times these protesters and activists just don't understand. We have a very big threat facing us right now. I talked about BSE, foot and mouth, and avian swine flu. But avian flu, but African swine fever is a very real threat as well. There's been an outbreak in China which has decimated the Chinese hog population. It has spread now through most of Southeast Asia, Central America, and many parts of Eastern Europe. The impact of African swine fever, were it to come here to Canada, would be profound. The pork industry in Canada is a $24 billion industry in our country. It's 45,000 jobs from gate to plate. 70% of the hogs that we raise here in Canada are exported. $4.25 billion. If there was an outbreak of African swine fever in Canada, international markets would close like that. And it would take us years, as we learned with BSE, to rebuild that confidence in those export markets and try and regain that global opportunity. The threats of these animal-borne diseases are very real, and we cannot take them lightly. Mr. Speaker, all of us in this House, we understand the impact COVID-19 has had on our constituencies and certainly every aspect and every industry in our economy. This is a human-borne virus that has brought our country and just about every country around the world to a screeching halt. Imagine what an animal-borne virus will do to Canada's agriculture industry, whether it's hogs, cattle, feathers. It would be devastating. And I think all of us in this House, if we had an opportunity to walk back in time and do a better job of preparing for the COVID-19 pandemic, which all of us as parliamentarians take some responsibility for, I know we would do that to have a better strategy in place to protect Canadians. We have that opportunity here today, Mr. Speaker, with this amendment to the Health of Animals Act, which will protect the health of animals on farm, but also protect the mental health of our farmers and our farm families. We cannot make the same mistake we have made in the past. We just simply can't afford an animal-borne disease or virus outbreak on farms or within processing plants across this country. Because, Mr. Speaker, I believe that we have dug ourselves a very deep financial hole as a result of COVID-19. And there are only a few industries that as Canadians we can look to and rely on to help dig us out of that financial hole. Energy would be one, agriculture is the other. But if we don't provide agriculture with the resources and the safeguards that they need to ensure that they are protected, then we are leaving them vulnerable. And I don't think that's anything any Canadian would support. And I was encouraged to see a comment from the Liberal Minister of Agriculture the other day that said there are unacceptable actions of extremist groups protesting on dairy farms. And I know it's a concern of hers as well. So strengthening the biosecurity measures for trespassers on farms, ranches, processing plants are something that farm groups, commodity groups, and processors across this country support. And I've been honored to have their letters and emails and quotes of support from across this country, which has really buoyed our efforts on this private member's bill. And I am confident, Mr. Speaker, that the Liberal government, as well as my colleagues throughout this House, also understand the mental health strain that our farm families are under right now, but also the importance of protecting our food security and our food supply, especially now as we try and rebuild and come out of this pandemic. This is no time to put our food supply and our food security at risk. Now, I really want to leave this message very clear with my colleagues, as I know the opposition to this private member's bill is going to be based on this. In no way is this bill a prohibition on protesting. You are more than welcome to protest on public property, on the gravel road, on the highway, outside the farm fence. But there has to be a line in the sand, Mr. Speaker. And that line is when you cross onto private property and put the health of a farm family, their workers, and their animals at risk. We must do everything we possibly can to put protections in place for our food security and our food supply. As I said, we cannot make the same mistake we have in the past when it comes to animal-borne diseases that would devastate our agriculture industry. This is an opportunity to be proactive, Mr. Speaker, and I look forward to the questions and support from my colleagues throughout this House. Thank you very much.
Questions.